My group's project is over medieval burials and cemeteries. Please enjoy.
Hello, my name is Matthew Mann, and this is my presentation on medieval Rome burials and cemeteries. To start off, my group's research question is, what are the differences of medieval burials and cemeteries around the world and the culture that they show? Specifically, cemetery archaeology is very important as it provides and is one of the most important sources for early medieval social history. Thousands of cemeteries are still found today and are excavated all around the world, and they give us great information on the culture and how that time was around during the Middle Ages, and specific for my presentation, Rome. Also, it's very important because the artifacts that we find are put into museums. They show different things that help us. A common constant in medieval burials is that around different classes, they were buried in different ways. You know, especially with Christianity, popes were buried different ways as they were embalmed with spices. They would also be rubbed with white wine. This was believed to preserve the corpse for up to 8 days, and they would do different embalming practices to help ensure that. Something unique about medieval Europe is how they feared political transitions, so they would actually bury 2 different coffins to create the illusion of continuity. They would think that if they buried one coffin that was empty, that spirit would linger on and that their influence would still continue. There are 5 different parts of the burial process. The first part is the procession. Something interesting about the procession is that they actually had professional mourners if you were wealthy and you were able to purchase these. The professional mourners would act like they were super upset, they would cry, they would like pull their hair out and just scream, would do all these different types of things. They didn't even know the person, they were literally just hired. Another thing about it is that they would have freedmen that would dress up like their ancestors. This was believed that if they did that, their ancestors, it would reproduce their personas. And when this was done, their bodies were then taken and cremated, which is the second part of the process, which is cremated and burial. The third part of the process is the eulogy, which we know today and still do, where if someone dies, we will give a speech about them. They would do this too, and after this was done, they would always have a feast. After the feast was done, they would have commemoration, where they would make offerings to the loved ones, and they would also have parentalia, which was held between February 13th to the 21st, which would honor the family's ancestors. Thank you.
Messages from the past are found in many cemeteries through symbols all over the world. Many have wondered what these symbols mean and have spent a great deal of time studying them and trying to decode them. Here are a few symbols found in medieval cemeteries. Dogs often represented the fidelity of a woman. If you saw a hunting dog, it normally meant a status or earthly grandeur of the person that was buried there. A dove is a symbol of Christ that's also associated with the Gospels. Lambs, of which today we normally see associated with children's graves, were a symbol of Christ or sacrifice, or the person who was buried there suffered a great sacrifice. Lions often were for the knights or hedelic symbols that also represented Christ. You also saw some stags that showed the person's trials of life. A tiger meant that the person was cunning or fierce who was buried there. Normally you'll see a knight depicted with a standing on the head of a lion, or showing their ferocity against this lion. You also see mythical creatures on the tombs, like mermaids or the griffins. The griffins were thought to be the guardians of the dead and protected who was buried there. A skull and bone meant that the person buried there symbolized their mortality or their wish to be immortal. Then you have these etchings, such as on the St. Mary Virgin Church in Tustin, England, were thought to ward off evil, sort of an anti-witchcraft evil. You found several of these all over the church. So these are just a few of the symbols that I found interesting. I hope you all did as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Whitney Keaton, and today I'm going to be talking about medieval tombstones in Serbia and Bosnia. These type of medieval tombstones are known as stecies. Steci means standing stone. They are commonly found in areas along the present border between Serbia and Bosnia. Burial under these stones was conducted in the 14th and 15th centuries in Serbia. About 30% of the steci stones are decorated with bas-reliefs of predominantly low technical sophistication. Their striking beauty ranges from single symbols such as crosses to crescents and rosettas. As of July 2016, the Steci medieval tombstone graveyards have been included in the UNESCO World Heritage List. There are roughly 70,000 surviving Steci stones today. The establishment of the general framework for the study of the Steci imagery is complicated by the religious makeup of the medieval Bosnian state. Despite the existence of the Bosnian Church, the time in which the majority of the Steci stones were discovered, there were a significant number of Catholics and Christians in medieval Bosnia. The origin of the stones is primarily found in the teachings of the Bosnian Church, but also links with heterodox Christian movements. The Steci stone should be seen in relation to complex liminal psychosocial processes, rather than just simple illustrations of the deceased individual's lifetime achievements or of their hopes of the afterlife. And that's the end.
Good afternoon, this is Lily Midget, and I'm going to be reporting on the medieval European ivory caskets. Ivory caskets were symbols of wealth and status in the medieval world. They were often imported from West Africa, Egypt, and Arabia. The carvings were often intricate and detailed. People during these times had no ethical issues with ivory caskets because they interpreted the Bible, specifically Genesis, to mean that all the resources on the earth were provided by God, so they had divine run of the world. You can see here the casket with warriors and dancers. It's an 11th century Byzantine casket, and it depicts some symbols that were common for Dionysus and can be seen as an attribute to Dionysus. This casket shows a concern more with the everyday life, and specifically secular life, rather than the church activities. And just a reminder, this was not exclusive to Byzantium and Western Europe. This was seen all over internationally, specifically in Islamic art. This was pretty common. As you can see here, these are the panels from the Werden casket. It was made in about 800 in the Rhine area, and it depicts biblical and other religious stories. And as you see here, this is the Madinat al-Zahra casket. It was made in about the 960s CE. There are plants around it, which are a possible symbol of fertility. And as you can see here, this is the Morgan casket. It's from the 11th and 12th centuries from Norman, Italy. It shows men in turbans on the corners protecting the casket, which can allude to a very international environment, what with men in turbans and this being a casket from Italy. To conclude, caskets were an international expression of grief and art during the Middle Ages. The act of getting ivory was very expensive, and this was mostly reserved for wealthy people. They could be gifted. Ivory boxes were not limited to only being caskets, but they typically were caskets. This was embraced internationally, not just in Europe, and it was a sign of wealth and status reserved typically for the elites. And as you can see here, that is my works cited. Thank you.
Medieval grave reopenings. The medieval grave reopenings started around the 6th century AD in Europe and peaked approximately 200 years later. Europe experienced a rash of grave reopenings, and other areas as well experienced those grave reopenings. Areas in Romania, France, Germany, and England. There has been a long debate as to why grave reopenings were taking place, as no one was ever caught. Some speculate robbery was the main cause, but that is debatable, as valuables were not always taken. Was there some form of ritual being done, or was it just to desecrate the graves and disturb the dead? It appears that certain type of objects were taken during the grave reopenings, such as swords and brooches. One would have thought objects of value would have been taken, but that appears to not have always been the case. Were the grave reopenings being done by relatives to take something to remember the deceased by, or were items like swords being taken because of a weapon or metal shortage? During the grave reopenings, other things were being done aside of items being taken. Skeletal remains were being removed or rearranged, such as a foot would be put by the head, or the head was being turned. And sometimes even a deceased dog was being put in the graves. Grave reopenings remains a mystery to present time, but one has to think, has grave reopenings really stopped, or have they just gone unnoticed?